The Harper Paradox. Stephen Harper's Puzzling Justice Policies. This presentation begins with a simple question. Why did Stephen Harper, Canada's Conservative Prime Minister from 2006 to 2015, quote, get tough on crime? People thought they knew the answer. He did it to get votes, or because he's a hard-headed ideological bent toward punishment. And Harper's supporters thought they knew too, because they said that the justice system needed reforming. But these answers are only partially correct at best, and, well, that's just a polite way of saying that they're wrong. I'm David Summerhays. I hope you'll stick around for this presentation because this is one of the strangest stories I think you're ever going to hear. There are a lot of surprises here. Harper, for one thing, is one of the most enigmatic and honestly secretive figures in Canadian politics. So we can't just ask him why he did it. He'll just say, oh, there was a rise in crime and liberals are too soft like he always did. But through listening to this presentation, you're going to learn about, well, the Canadian justice system and good justice policy, Canadian politics, but I think most interestingly of all, we'll learn about conservatism. What motivates this ideology, and what's the best way to dialogue with conservatives? Now, another thing, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, I think you're going to believe that Harper taught you something valuable. And that's a bit of a surprise as well, isn't it? Especially if you're a critic of Harper's. Well, this is a serious topic, and I really think Harper did harm, but I think this is less bad than some people are expecting. Now, the issue here is that we have a square peg, round hole problem. The usual explanations don't fit the facts. In other words, the main issue is that there's no reason to believe that Harper's tough on crime policies really won him that many votes, and quite possibly the opposite. And in any case, Harper seems to have chosen this issue because few people care about justice policy. And second, Harper didn't make significant changes to the justice system. And yet, he spent a huge percentage of his time as Prime Minister deceiving the Canadian public about this. That is the Harper Paradox. His policies didn't win many votes, yet he spent a lot of time and effort on them. That didn't do much to change the system either, his policies, I mean. So this is the root of the mystery. And to solve the mystery, we need to find a plausible explanation that seems to fit the facts. So here's what this presentation will look like. We're going to talk about a bit of context, what Harper did, and I can tell you there's a surprise there. Then we'll look at why Harper did what he did. And again, there is a surprise here. And we're going to play basically a game of Clue, where we'll line up a bunch of suspects and point out why a number of them clearly didn't do it. And finally, we'll conclude, well, with what this all says about conservatism. And once again, I think there's a surprise here. And I think this presentation will have a lot to teach anyone who dialogues with conservatives and particularly advocates of restorative justice and a less punitive justice system. Now, I'm not a fan of Harper's policies, but before I start, I really want to say that in reading my critiques of what Harper did, I was a little disappointed. I felt that a lot of them focused on why they didn't like what Harper did, which is important, but I felt that very few critiques of Harper really took the time to take Harper seriously and try to understand Harper from his own point of view, but not just say because he says he's getting tough on crime to assume that he just got tough on crime. We really need to, or just panicking and saying, look at all the harm that he did, so he's terrible. We don't need an evaluative judgment quite yet. I just wanted to hear more presentations that take the time and have more empathy for what Harper's trying to do and his ideology. So I'm really trying to be as non-judgmental as possible while also evaluating and providing facts. So let's start with a chart here. this is some context. We have police reported crime rate in Canada from 1962 to 2013. And as we see here, it is rising. And then in 1990, it hits a peak and is falling at a pretty constant rate for the next 20 or so years, 25 years. Harper arrives here in 2006, and as you can see, the decline has slowed slightly and then restarted again. There's no way that his policies caused the continue of this decline. Um, in fact, most of this is driven by demographics. It's very simple. When people are younger, they're more impulsive. So when there's more young people in a population, you'll see a higher um, uh, um, crime rate. And when there's less young people in a population, by young I mean under 25, uh, you'll see less crime rate. And not surprisingly, based on this, government surveys show a high or very high perception of safety in Canada, basically 90% or over, which is among the best in the world. And this is the case in big cities, across provinces, even in the prairies, which have a higher rate of criminality. And for this reason, voters have other priorities. And that goes for conservative voters too. Um, Conservative voters just have other priorities, and this isn't a top priority. Moreover, it's important to note that there are costs to having tough on crime policies among swing voters. They get sick of the doom and gloom, and they get tempted by a more sunny message like a Justin Trudeau. Finally, just a word about context. There's been a consensus in Canada since the Second World War. Let the experts run justice policy, and the experts say rehabilitate and train offenders. Don't be vengeful, don't humiliate them, don't punish them excessively or for no reason. Protect society, and then help offenders as much as we can. And um, so that's the consensus in Canada when Harper is coming to power. Now, another piece of context just to keep in mind that south of the border, things are getting a little crazy. So this isn't incarceration rate, this is overall population, but basically the US population stays about the same and the incarceration rate, incarceration numbers jump like crazy. So we see a huge jump in incarceration rate in the US. And before that time, up to 1970, for about a century, the US and Canada had pretty much identical incarceration rates for quite a while. And then things started to shift in the US. And the fear was that Harper would change things in Canada the same way. So the explanation for this massive mass incarceration campaign in the US, the why is complicated and quite racist, but the policy tools to make it happen are dead simple. And this is what we're going to watch for in Harper. So the first is to create a kind of cross-party consensus, like get not just other parties, but judges and lawyers and prosecutors and so forth, to agree that we need to get tougher on crime. So the more consensus you have, the more likely you are to see an incarceration boom. Next, you have investing zillions of dollars into the justice arena, because you have to pay for more police, prosecutors, jails, prisons, guards, parole officers, and judges. And finally, and we need omnibus legislation, that is to say, legislation that changes many laws at once, so larger legislation, rather than one that just writes one new law, but rather basically updates the criminal code all at once. And that omnibus legislation needs to include tougher sentences. And let me just tell you, the kind of favorite tool of the tough on crime crowd is the mandatory minimum sentence. So what that means is that most sentences will say there's a maximum and a suggested minimum. So the maximum is mandatory. You can't give more than the maximum for, let's say, robbery with a firearm or something like that, or drunk driving. And then there's a suggested minimum that says we don't think most people should get less than this amount. However, the minimum is left to judicial discretion. So a judge could say, well, in this case, the person doesn't deserve the minimum. They deserve less than the minimum because there have been other circumstances. And really, that's pretty good for society to leave judicial discretion when possible because they know the specifics of the case and the legislator does not. Um, and the but a mandatory minimum sentence removes the judicial discretion and says nobody can receive less than this minimum. And the most famous example of that is the three-strike legislation and law in California, which said that anyone who's convicted of 3 felonies will get a life sentence no matter what. So that's a mandatory minimum sentence. And just to mention that down south, this tough on crime boom that we saw 2 slides ago, um, here, it ruined lives, split communities, moved parents away from their children, was extremely racist, didn't make the U.S. any safer at all, very, very little rehabilitation. A lot of people were wasting time in detention where there is no training or rehabilitation. No training, it cost billions and billions of dollars over 40 years and counting, and it clogged the system, which is one of the ironies of getting tough on crime. Fewer people plead guilty because the consequences are so stiff, and then this causes huge delays, which ironically causes people to get off on statutes of limitations. Um, and let me just tell you that Harper knew all this because experts told him, don't get tough on crime, it's a disaster. In fact, Texas conservatives were interviewed by the CBC telling Harper, we've tried this tough on crime thing, the mandatory minimums, don't do it. It's a disaster. Anyway, and this interview made headlines and it never deterred Harper's plans. Um, and by the way, I have never heard of a criminologist expert who recommends getting tough on crime. They know that policy wise, it is a failure. So, Harper gets to power in 2006, and from 2006 to 2015, of the 399 uh, government laws, 81 of them are tough on crime, with 53 new mandatory minimums. So, this is a major priority of the Harper government in his 9 years in power. And even private members, almost half of private member bills are tough on crime legislation, of which 15 become law. So, major priority for the government. And things change. I was a volunteer with the Correctional Service of Canada at the time, and I was hearing about increased use of solitary confinement, which is a form of torture in prisons, restrictions on parole, which the correctional investigator Ivan Singer described as having human rights implications. That's just a cheerful way of saying potential human rights violations. Anyway, also importantly, Harper cut a bunch of programs. I mean, prison farms, Lifeline, eliminated the faint hope clause, which got about 3 or 4 people a shorter sentence per year. Almost dropped circles of support and accountability before police officers protested. Reduced volunteer and chaplain access to prisons and prisoners. And then a number of laws that punished a small percentage more severely. Well, consecutive rather than concurrent sentencing, toughening pardon, more crimes led to adults being tried as adolescents being tried as adults, and people got less credit for the time they spent in detention over prison. Used to be time and a half, and then Harper made it day per day. Um, and I heard about all of this as a Correctional Service of Canada volunteer. So why is it that I'm saying that there's some surprise here? It sounds like Harper did get tough on crime, so what's going on? Well, a number of things. First of all, Harper entered the political fray. One surprise is that Harper entered the political fray in 2006, talking about the need to get tough on crime. Like I mentioned, not really a voter priority. And actually, surprise number two, Harper had been in the public sphere for almost 20 years at that point, and this is really the first time that he had so emphasized this issue of getting tough on crime, and it happened once he became party leader. Um, but here we get to surprise number three, which is despite all the legislation, despite all the mandatory minimums, despite all of Harper's rhetoric, um, overall it would be misleading to say that Harper got tough on crime because Harper was misleading the Canadian public about it. And this was a surprise to people who studied Harper after 2015. So let me give you an example of the kinds of laws that Harper was putting into place. So, for instance, in 2013, a suspect stabbed and killed a police dog named Quanto. And as usual, as Harper had already been doing for years at this point, he seized upon this rare and extreme headline to announce a new mandatory minimum sentence. So, with his wife and Minister Rona Ambrose, pictured here, in front of a team of dog trainers, Harper flew to Edmonton in person to announce a new mandatory minimum sentence against anyone who harms a service animal. Now, a few things to note here. First of all, the pre existing law had sentenced Quanto's assailant to 18 months in prison. Whereas therefore, this pre-existing law was not soft or broken, as Harper claimed or implied. And Harper's new mandatory minimum was a minimum of 6 months. So clearly, this new law was not a response to any problem with the previous law. Um, but also note that after this theatrical, personal announcement of the new bill, which made headlines across the country, Quanto's bill didn't become law for 407 days, and this is despite the fact that it met with zero opposition from the opposing parties. And what we see is basically, and this comes back over and over, I'll give a couple more examples. Initial theatrics is the priority, whereas the legislation is obviously not the priority. Rather, Harper prefers to jump on major extreme crimes rather than omnibus legislation. One of Harper's few omnibus bills, the Safe Streets and Communities Act, is a textbook case of political theater. Some changes were significant, new restrictions on parole and modifying the Correctional Service of Canada's mandate. Others less significant, like increased ministerial discretion in approving international transfer of prisoners. Anyway, in reality, this new omnibus bill was a collection of bills that had died on order paper due to previous dissolutions of Parliament that at the time in previous parliaments had faced minimal parliamentary opposition, and like Quanto's law, Harper just hadn't prioritized passing them. Because Quanto's law, considering there was no opposition and he had a majority government at the time, he could have passed in months, if not weeks, if not days, considering that it took him over 407. But keep it, like, for instance, Bill S10, later C15, later C26, which later passed as part of the Safe Streets and Communities Act, overall, which and also was one of Harper's campaign promises to, um, took 1,179 calendar days or 481 parliamentary sitting days to pass, despite passing third reading in the House of Commons. Um, and by the way, in response to the Safe Streets and Communities Act, the opposition parties took this opportunity to pretend that they'd been opposing Harper's policies all along, which they had not. Um, and I could go on and on. For instance, I'll just give this last example. Harper passed a new mandatory minimum against mischief on war memorials in 2014, which was only relevant in 3 complaints out of over 1,300,000 accusations of mischief in 2015. It really just goes on and on. And overall, if we look at, again, those 4 policy areas that led to a toughening of crime in the US, well, Harper didn't do any of them. Harper failed and really never attempted to create a cross-party provincial or judiciary consensus for getting tough on crime. And for instance, Harper would criticize other parties that didn't oppose his legislation as soft, no matter whether they supported or opposed. And at some point they said, you know what, we're just going to oppose what you do. You criticize us anyway. That's not the kind of thing that creates a consensus. Spending was the same per capita in 2015 as it was when Harper came to power in 2006. Same number of police officers per capita, same number of prison beds per capita. The incarceration rate didn't change over those years. And even if you look at the severity of punishment, that didn't change, with the exception of a few drug trafficking crimes. So even punishments against sex crimes didn't change or become significantly more severe. For instance, if you compare somebody that got sentenced for the same thing before Harper and after Harper, their punishment tended to be exactly the same. And like I mentioned, Harper didn't use much omnibus legislation, and when he did, it was usually just collecting other bills that he'd introduced one by one that he just hadn't passed. So we just need to remove the idea that Harper really was, in a policy way, trying to get tough on crime. And so what we end up with is sort of the trumpet, the cymbal versus the brass tacks. And Harper and his top brass prioritize theatrics over legislation. It's really the trumpeting this message over any brass tacks change. Harper seized every major crime personally to trumpet a new mandatory minimum, and the more Harper trumpeted a new policy, usually the less impact that policy tended to have, like Quanto's law, which had very little impact. And the more a change was truly significant, like solitary confinement in prison or a 200% rise in suicide rates in the prisons, the less Harper talked about it. So let's look at our list of suspects now that we've talked about what Harper did. Well, we've got interest groups, ignorance or ideology, like hard headed ideological stance, substantive change, elections, populism, and conservatism. So let's go through these one by one. Interest groups, pretty easy to eliminate. There's no major influential interest group who benefits from getting tough on crime. The prison guard union is not a major player in Ottawa, especially not with the conservatives. Prisons are public in Canada, so prisoners aren't customers, and nobody lobbies to have more prisoners. Um, Harper considered privatizing but didn't. Uh, and Canadians, even Canadian conservatives, were not clamoring for tough on crime policies. So, what about ignorance? Well, Harper's a policy wonk who united two conservative parties. He was prime minister for 9 years, worked at a think tank, and experts had come to parliament and told him. So he knew. And we could say, well, he's closed minded or stubbornly ideological. Okay, then why didn't he make like significant change despite pretending that he was and claiming that he was going to and introducing bills that sounded like he was and he wasn't? So that doesn't sound that closed minded or stubbornly ideological to me. It sounds like some kind of trickery or something. Okay. Well, there goes that idea. What about real change? Well, that's not the right suspect. Harper claimed to be responding to a crisis, but basically just didn't act like it. Um, and besides, Harper's conservative, and getting tough on crime I thought was conservative, so why the deception? Um, it's like, Harper's ministers, yeah, they got made the prisons tougher, but really this wasn't the majority nor the priority in what Harper was doing. The priority was that trumpeting changes and legislative changes that had very little overall impact. Um, okay, well, elections. Harper did it to win votes. Okay, and listen, I'm not saying that what Harper did didn't have any benefits electorally at all. Maybe it did. I'm saying there's reasons to doubt that it did. Um, but just keep in mind that, like I said, even conservative voters don't prioritize getting tough on crime. Like Harper had critics, including conservative critics, Conrad Black, the Canadian Taxpayers Alliance. In fact, Alberta, under a conservative government, conservative province, had done a major decarceration in the 90s, less than a decade before Harper took power. So it's not like conservatives are just like married to this issue this way. And like I mentioned, the cost on swing voters. And overall, just a disproportionate effort by Harper. He's clearing his schedule to run across the country as prime minister. He's busy. And so if we can't find many votes that he's gaining, I would argue, well, the point is, even if Harper thinks he's gaining a few votes here and there, that still doesn't mean it's the only reason he's enacting a conservative policy, right? A lot of the critics who said, oh, he's doing this for votes, they would say he was doing it only for votes. And what I'm trying to say is that votes just isn't a sufficient explanation. Plus, Harper's main motivation in life is to make Canada more conservative or more friendly to conservatives. So, why is he enacting conservative policy and telling everybody that he will, but only for electoral gain? That doesn't add up. It doesn't sound like Harper. So, again, I don't know. I don't think so. We need to we need to dig deeper here. Well, populism, this is such a popular topic in academia. Um, just send me a question if you want to learn more about it. But basically, Harper did have tough on crime rhetoric that was populist. He maligns experts in populist fashion, Ottawa and centers of power and so forth. But populism doesn't explain why Harper did it. And let me put it this way. There are populists all over the world that are both on the left, like in Venezuela or in Cuba, and on the right, like Trump or Le Pen in France. And only right-wing populists are interested in getting tough on crime. It doesn't tend to be a left-wing populist issue, which to me says that we need to look at suspect number 6. We can't get a full picture unless we look at ideology. And by ideology, I mean conservatism. So, how does conservatism help us explain the Harper paradox? Um, so keeping in mind that Most ideological actors like Harper want radical, concrete, or at least a change with a clear direction toward an ideology. And most people who are seeking electoral advantage prefer symbolic change that doesn't rock the boat. Now, the Harper paradox is that Harper is an ideological actor who prioritizes largely symbolic policies. Um, and so, how does this notion of conservatism help us explain why Harper is so excited to trumpet these policies? The good news is that if you're a student of Harper, it's not too hard to find the answer. One concept that comes back in Harper from 2003 to 2018, his book in 2018 and a famous speech of his in 2003, is this notion of nihilism, which, even though he hadn't named it before 2003 publicly, seems to be a major part of his thinking going back to the 80s. So in 2003, he writes, "The left has become a moral nihilism, the rejection of any tradition or convention of morality, a post-Marxism with deep resentments, even hatreds of the norms of free and democratic Western civilization." So here, Harper is really railing against the left and this fear of its lack of moral rootedness. In 2018, he talks of deconstructionists, postmodernists, post-structuralists, and nihilists of every shape and form. Um, Still speaking of the left. So it seems to be a deep concern of Harper's, this notion of nihilism. And in 2003, he writes, serious conservative parties simply cannot shy away from values questions. On a wide range of public policy questions, including criminal justice and corrections, social values are increasingly the really big issues. And, well, some people would say, we shouldn't, like Harper's 2003 Civitas speech is kind of a fiery one, and, you really shouldn't believe every word of it to sort of as one author put it, be the alpha and the omega of everything Harper thinks. But the fact that it comes back in 2018 is a sign that this is really an important concept. And, well, like I said, Harper, he says that social values are increasingly the really big issues. Well, he makes social values really the central issue through his criminal justice policies. And if we look back at what they are, you can really put them under the categories of sex, drugs, rock and roll, and guns. It's, it's possession of a firearm obtained through an offense. It's new mandatory minimums against pedophilia and drug trafficking and barbaric cultural practices and car racing and war memorials and so on and so forth. Pretty much anti-60s, anti-hippie culture. And, you know, and if you take a step back and we just look at what was Harper trying to accomplish in these years, um, we could say that the reason Harper is interested in loudly pretending, to a large degree, to make sentencing more severe has less to do with crime or criminals or criminality and everything to do with rooting Canada in its moral values. And this is why Harper chose symbolically powerful, shocking, extreme, and rare crimes, believing that Canadians could unite around these values. And so the promise is more important than the delivery of punishment. Imagined punishment of rare and extreme criminality is the goal. And the hope is that just as we can define nationalism as imagined community, Harper's hope is that imagined punishment around these shared values will strengthen Canadian nationalism. And this fits with Harper's other priorities, like commemorating the War of 1812 or the First World War of 1914, or Harper's Arctic expeditions, and even the Olympic Games, which Harper uh, writes glowingly about in his 2018 book. So a small minority of people will say, "Oh yeah, obviously I didn't need this presentation to tell you that Harper was doing this for social conservative reasons. I knew that." Um, but here again, we have another paradox. And here again, the deeper we dig, the stranger it gets. But it's just going to take another presentation because I am out of time and out of energy. So we'll have to cut this short. Um, but basically, there are a couple of questions that I'll dig into in the next presentation. So the first is this idea of moral conservatism. First, like, where does Harper get the idea that nihilism is such a pressing problem? I expect that a number of folks listening to this, if you're conservative, will say, well, yeah, it's a big problem. But if you're not conservative, you'll say, huh? Really? Moral rootedness? Like, seriously? Um, but this presentation has failed if I haven't communicated the urgency which pushed Harper to scramble to the site of rare and extreme criminal events in order to announce a new mandatory minimum sentence that did next to nothing. Um, where does this sense of urgency come from? And why and how might this kind of symbolism be expected to transform Canada? And um, if and what about this term moral conservatism? What's moral about it? And I don't mean that as polemic or a cheap shot. I just mean if we look at moral traditions, like what about the Christian tradition of love, charity, and even forgiveness? I mean, Jesus commands his disciples to remember people in prison. Um, the love, charity, and forgiveness were not Harper's moral traditions that he was defending with tough on crime policies. It was certainly not forgiveness of people who have committed crimes. It was more severe punishment of them. Again, the point isn't to say that that's invalid, um, although I think it is. The point isn't polemic or criticism of Harper. The point is that our understanding of moral conservatism is inadequate. It's been understudied. And what are these moral traditions and why those moral traditions? Why not the more forgiveness kinds of moral traditions? And don't tell me that it's just sort of Harper's seeking kind of a balance of punishment and forgiveness when Harper's not changing the balance of actual punishment. There's a moral tradition at stake here that's a little bit hard to fathom. Why that tradition and why not more forgiveness? So those are fundamental questions here that we have not understood Harper without starting to tackle these questions. Um, and again, people will define conservatism as defending tradition. Well, why is Harper going against a 40-year multi-party Canadian tradition on justice matters, critiquing that consensus, and insisting on both the symbolic punishment of criminals and while allowing his ministers to make the correctional service more punitive? Harper's opposing a tradition, and it's not status quo-ism like some people describe conservatism, because Harper is disrupting the status quo by criticizing it in the name of tradition. So which tradition? And just to be clear, none of this means that Harper's a revolutionary or reactionary or even particularly extreme. Again, the problem is the understanding of conservatism, whereas Harper is just normal. He's just a relatively modest conservative, and the problem is that our understanding of conservatism is inadequate to describe him. And I could go on and on. Like Harper is a small government conservative, according to many biographers. So why is he giving such a central role to the central government in, quote, getting tough on crime as prime minister? And also in this moral conservatism. What's the role of government in all this? Um, so on and on. And what's the best way to dialogue with these people? Well, that's the question I want to end on. Is how do we dialogue with moral conservatives? How do advocates and dialogue with moral conservatives? So let's play a kind of centrist politician. Let's say, the kind of line that's, I'm going to expand the welfare state for dental care, or something like that, but I'm going to get tough on crime to show that I'm governing for all Canadians. And I think we could imagine let's say a conservative or even a liberal prime minister saying something like this, because that's pretty much what Bill Clinton did in his triangulation in the 90s when he got tough on crime. So has Harper taught us anything helpful in this situation? Let's say you're granted a meeting with this liberal politician, liberal party politician. What do? Well, what I would tell you is that, sorry, I forgot to change the slide. What I would tell you is that Harper has taught us quite the lesson that it's possible to, quote, get tough on crime without punishment. And if you think about that, that's kind of an amazing lesson. That's a kind of incredible policy priority that we can combat nihilism without actually getting tough on prisoners or changing the prison culture or cutting programs or really anything, because the two aren't necessarily related, even though they might be related in actual fact. Well, let me give you an example. For instance, Harper's Protecting Canada's Seniors Act of 2012, well, that law got tough on senior crime uh, without punishing a single person more severely. And I've had lawyers and criminologists tell me this, repeated several of them. And I think anytime a politician is talking about tough on crime scenarios or being a centrist politician, I think it'd be brilliant to remind them the lesson that Harper just taught us, namely that we don't need to actually get tough on real criminals and waste their time in jail for no reason, without a valid reason. We can pretend that we're doing it. And in fact, Harper may have learned this wisdom from the Liberals, the Liberal Party of Canada, namely the Youth Criminal Justice Act of 2002. Back then, the Liberals who were in power presented this 2002 act as getting tough on youth crime, emphasizing the vast minority of offenders who would be sentenced more harshly under the new law, whereas in reality, the Youth Criminal Justice Act was a rehabilitative tectonic shift. It was evidence based and very effective diversion of youth away from incarceration and toward programs that actually work and cost way less. Incarceration rates for youth plummeted across the country, and criminologists agree that Canada and Canada's youth were better as a result. There was no wave of crime after that. No, it was better outcomes for kids, period. Um, and as I'm trying to imply, the problem with Harper's justice policy isn't that he, quote, got tough on crime. I don't care about the symbolic policies as long as they don't harm people without a valid reason. And the issue is that Harper did harm people without a valid reason, even if it was far less people than he was letting on, and it might have seemed at the time. Um, so, in conclusion, this presentation has contributed a ton to our understanding of Harper, Canadian politics, conservatism, especially Harper's motivations. It's eliminated the idea of electoral gain and populism and transforming the justice system as plausible sole explanations for Harper's justice policies. And we've identified a central paradox in those policies, namely this notion of substantive symbolism, symbolic policies that he hopes that will actually change Canada. And we fit all this in conservative nation building. Harper's justice policies are part of his attempt to build a more conservative nation around the punishment of rare and extreme criminal events. In the next presentation, though, we'll have to look more at what kind of conservatism we're looking at here in Harper's justice policies.